Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm very excited to be here. My name is Ariana. If you don't already know me, I'm the co-director of the Consent Academy. We are a Seattle-based nonprofit hoping to uh, talk about consent and all of its complexity and potential. And uh, today we are going to be chatting with a different nonprofit organization called Pleasurable. I've been a big fan for a little while. And Ash, do you want to introduce yourself?
I am the other co-director of the Consent Academy. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, across the world from Ariana, and very excited to be able to join this group, also scattered across the world. Yeah, really excited for stream today.
Ashira, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Ashira. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm with Pleasurable.
Thank you. And Kaz?
Thank you. My name is Kaz. My pronouns are they, them, and I am one of the co-founders of Pleasurable.
Thank you. And Sarah, would you introduce yourself?
Sarah. My pronouns are they, them, and I am here with Pleasurable.
Wonderful. So, could one of you tell our audience what is Pleasurable all about?
So this is one of the problems we have with a democratic process. Is we're like, which one of us should speak first? We haven't gotten that down yet. So I would say that we are a group, a collective of people. We're currently 8 people who we're focusing on sexuality and disability, primarily on education and activism within sexuality and disability intersection. And we have a directory on our website of people who work at the intersection of disability and sexuality. We host monthly peer support calls and co-working calls. We have some resource guides. We're slowly getting started. So, yeah.
So, what would be your sort of like elevator pitch type of like goal? Like, if you had one goal of like what your org could offer, what would you want to offer people?
Sarah or Ashira?
I think we're primarily aiming to build a community among like disabled sex educators with support events and co-working events, and like soon like a public online community, and sort of both curating knowledge, but also hopefully getting classes running and doing various consulting gigs for presenting education around sexuality and disability.
Yeah, I would say that it's hard to kind of think of, one specific goal that we have because the field is so broad and we really want to tackle many different areas. I think it's more of a question of, what do we want to roll out first, second, third, etc. So for now, we're trying to focus on just getting through the rest of 2022 and seeing where that takes us and seeing how we can build.
Yes, to that.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's often the way nonprofits go, which is just like, we have all these goals, but the biggest one is stay in operation, stay in business, not have everybody get burnt out. Oh, hello, Elmira. Thanks for joining. Elmira was our guest last weekend, and I recommend everybody check out their stream. It's really good. Anyway, so then I guess my question then is like, what got you interested in having an organization that is trying to talk about the intersections of disability, sexuality, and consent? because I know you've said a lot of it is you want to have this sort of peer support network, especially of disabled sex educators. And I think that there are a lot of ways that that can happen, but sort of what made you want to have an org that wanted to put out more information about the intersection between disability and sexuality?
So in 2016, my co-founder and I, Amber, we attended a sexuality conference, and it was highly inaccessible and very non-inclusive and actually pretty hostile toward disability and disabled people. And we decided that that wasn't going to be a thing that we were going to tolerate, and we were going to bring together people to work on creating a group. I should point out we're not actually a nonprofit. We are a fiscally sponsored group, but we're not a nonprofit.
I see.
So we came together and started bringing together different ideas about how we could exist and what we could do and why we would do them. And I think one of the big whys has been in sexuality education and in the sexuality professional world, however you want to call that, whether that be education or surrogacy or art or performance, whatever it may be, disability is rarely visible, even by people with non-visible disabilities. There's very little representation, or there's very little of people claiming disability identity and speaking from a disabled perspective. So while there might be the representation there, we're not hearing, seeing, witnessing it being reflected. And so Amber and I decided, well, we need it reflected, and put together all these different ideas. And it's taken several years, from medical issues and housing instability and a pandemic and all of these different issues that have come up that have now led us to 2022, and, well, technically December of 2021, and Pleasurable starting.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ash.
I appreciate you saying that, and I've been through a lot of sexuality education, and only in the last few years, 2016, absolutely, I feel like there were not as many people talking about that, and I'm really sorry you had that experience at a conference. But I've been heartened to see that there's more opportunities, but there's still definitely not enough. So I'm glad that y'all exist.
Thank you. We're glad we exist too. We just have to stay in operations, as we said.
I'm really glad that y'all exist as well, because I think about, there have been a lot of conversations just about like general sex education in schools, and how like a common thing that people bring up is that there isn't enough discussion of consent, which is absolutely true. Like, I don't think consent was ever mentioned, but then also homosexuality was never mentioned, and definitely nothing to do with trans people. And it wasn't even until I was in college that I knew that you could be trans, and like it wasn't until later that I learned that you could be non-binary, and then I was like, oh, that's me. And it wasn't until even later that I started to even think about discussions of disability and consent and sexuality. Like, I often just felt like any of the disabilities that I had were sort of like a thing I ought to make up for, or like kind of be like, oh, I'm so thankful that someone will still have sex with me, even though whatever. And as you know, Aradin in our chat pointed out that asexuality exists. Like, that's often not talked about either. We have such a narrow sort of spectrum of things. But one of the things I've often found that is both confusing and saddening to me is the ways in which when I have tried to often talk about it, or when just sort of people talk about it in general, there's often this idea that if someone has a disability of any kind, visible or not, that they are either more childlike or somehow like uh, inherently asexual as a result of a disability. And I see a lot with, I don't know if you all know the YouTubers Squirmy and Grubs. Um, I'll put them in the chat. They are a couple that's like kind of YouTube famous. Um, and for the viewers, they are interabled couple. And yeah, people often think that they're faking it, or like people often assume that the wife is like the caretaker, or is the sister, or is the mom, and like get so upset when they're like, no, we're married and we're like a perfectly happy couple. Like there's nothing weird about us. We're just a regular couple. And I feel like, yes, basically, I feel like there's so little education on anything to do with disability and sexuality. And this idea that if you have a disability and you are in any kind of sexual or romantic relationship, it's somehow less than. So I'm very heartened that there are people out there just like specifically trying to counter this narrative in any fashion.
What are some of the big issues for you, either personally or in general, that you're really hoping to tackle specifically in terms of disability and sexuality?
I mean, for me personally, I would love to see disability. This is a little bit beyond the scope of Pleasurable specifically, but kind of what brought me to Pleasurable and makes me passionate about being part of the group is that I would love to see disability better represented within mainstream sex education. Kind of included there on the list of, different types of identities that we could be, and, very much part of DEI work, even though it's often left out. And I think that in order to do that and to really make that pitch and make it successful, we need to have a strong group of people with disabilities who are advocating for this, so that it doesn't come off as kind of this N of one issue. So I think for me, that's where a lot of my passion for being part of this group comes from. I don't remember your exact question. Was it what specifically you want to see from Pleasurable or work on within Pleasurable? I would say in tandem with the rest of the group, just really strengthening that community, strengthening that voice, strengthening that presence, so we could bring it across spaces.
So thank you.
And for me, Pleasurable is all about both sort of advocating for accessibility and education, but also advocating for acceptance and normalizing and advocating for pleasure, and sort of two-pronged thing where I was interested in joining Pleasurable earlier, but when I was working in grad school, and it was in grad school, I was actually working on exhibition design, which is education and creating environments that are for education. And not only was the stuff that we were being taught not accessible, not really designing accessible environments, but grad school in itself was a toxic environment for someone with disabilities. And so it was and then I ended up doing my thesis on consent and sexuality. And in doing that, I was like, well, these things are combined. And so it was this. Instead of now working as much as a designer as I sort of intended to, I kind of ended up in this field because there was a need for accessibility in education and accessibility in sexual education and accessibility when talking about sexuality and making that information accessible. And recognizing that there's stigma about sexuality outside of disability, but there's stigma about disability, and then the overlap of stigma of disabled sexuality was just the sort of thing that just sort of clicked for me. And a lot of it to me is about really talking about pleasure and the idea that people are deserving of pleasure and bodily autonomy and respect and systems that support them. And I'm definitely coming into this with a bit of like almost, I actually kind of rage, just this sort of, this is something that needs to be talked about. You know, this is representation that needs to exist and things that need to be talked about. And you know, I think it's sort of a matter of intersectionality in terms of the way we deal with the way that sexuality can be, that sexual expression is already, people are marginalized because of sexuality and marginalized because of disability, and that sort of 1-2 punch is just sort of like, no, this needs to stop.
If I can actually just add something onto that quickly. I think that something that's important for me in the conversation around pleasure specifically related to disability is that I feel like and consent, is that I feel like so many people with disabilities don't get to experience their bodies as their own and as something that they can enjoy and, you know, use for what they want to do in the world. I feel like a lot of times the disabled body is almost the property of, you know, the medical system, the healthcare system, the, you know, decision maker system, and to really be able to try to break a lot of that down. You know, you were talking about Squirmy and Grubs, and I've watched them on YouTube. I don't know them personally, but, you know, they're a great couple to watch. And, you know, being able to kind of have them as a resource, you know, that's out there in the world talking about these issues online, you know, and adding to that force of just breaking all this down, you know, that we don't necessarily fit those boxes and those preconceived ideas that society has set for us, I think, you know, really is so important. And I think pleasure really fits to, you know, unlock a lot of that, because it's not just the technical, clinical, it's really about the experience and the enjoyment.
For me, what I'd like to see happen is kind of twofold. Quite often when people are listing marginalized identities, they forget disability entirely. And that is in the world in general, as well as in the sexuality field. And I would like disability to no longer be the, hey, you forgot us, please add us. You know, I don't want us to be the afterthought anymore. And in so doing, I want the disabled person, the body, mind of a person with a disability to be normalized in sexuality education spaces. So, for example, in high school and younger, you don't get taught a lot about pleasure. You get taught maybe about how the mechanics work depending on where you live, and that's about it. But the mechanics actually work differently for everyone, particularly when it comes to pleasure. So some people might like their nipples rubbed, and other people might go, no, don't touch those. No, I don't enjoy that. And some people might be able to orgasm, and some people might not be able to, and that has nothing to do with disability necessarily. So just by normalizing the human bodily experience of sexuality and how diverse it can be and is, I think is one of our challenges, but also goals in terms of what the world can look like, how it can be more inclusive and accepting of people with disabilities, is to, through education, we can help people understand that we're not the other, We're not this separate entity that is so different and foreign and scary. And marginalized identities have all gone through this and continue to go through this. And I think people with disabilities is, we're really one of the last terrains, because disability is a universal experience. It's across all populations, it's across all marginalized identities. And to be able to say, well, that's not going to happen to me, or I'm scared that that might happen to me, so I don't want to have anything to do with that because that frightens me. I don't know what to think about that. I don't know how to react around that. That being a person with a disability. So I think just bringing in more education, bringing in the normalization of disabled personhood, whether it relates to sexuality or consent, pleasure, or just even existence, I think is a big goal for me personally.
Yeah. I think these are all great goals. I really just feel a lot of, I feel like I really agree, and I get where you all are coming from and also relate. And I definitely can relate to when Sarah mentioned kind of coming to a little bit from a place of rage and anger, and like, for sure, that is something that can be tough. And also just disability being forgotten about a lot. And I think that I sometimes get the impression that people want to not think about it the same way people don't want to think about death, because like being not disabled is always a temporary state, because like disability is there are many different types, and they come to us eventually, and I think people don't like that reminder of their own bodies, right? Like I've had friends who don't even want to like watch another friend like blow their nose or like floss their teeth or something, because they're like so freaked out about the idea of being reminded that they have a body. And I think that can be even heightened. And I also think about, I saw this really good news story recently on DW News, which is sort of like the Germany's news service, but in English. But they do stuff in German as well. And I'll put the video in the chat. And it was about disability and sexual activity, but they were specifically looking at this couple where both of them basically have very, very limited mobility. They can like control their chairs, but they cannot reach out and touch each other. They cannot initiate any kind of physical activity with each other without assistance. And part of what they talked about is how like they have an easier time of getting non-judgmental and respectful sexual assistance from sex workers than they do from like trained helpers, because they said a lot of the time they're like trained sex helpers can have a very like sort of paternalistic view of them, or like I'm saving this person, or whereas the sex workers are like, it's my job, I'm going to help people get off. That's what I do. And how I think that's also something that not a lot of people think about also when they think about sex work, is the idea that it is an important role to have in society to sort of assist with pleasure. And it's not just like, I don't know, weird dudes who just want to use somebody or something. It's like a whole spectrum of different types of people who in some way, shape, or form need assistance when it comes to sexual pleasure and pleasure in their own bodies. And I think that yeah, you all brought up a lot of really good points. I feel like I could just talk forever about so many of the different things y'all said. Yeah, so it seems like also Boots has just joined. So I will let Boots in the room. Yeah. So, goodness, I get these bots that come in that sometimes are like, do you want to be famous? Come here. And then I keep blocking that term. And now there's a new version of the term. So I have a new version. There's like buy followers. And it's like, genuinely, I don't want to be famous. But yeah.
Not sure if Boots knows we're here.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Um,
Oh.
Hello.
Hello, Boots. Welcome. So we've just been chit-chatting. Boots, would you like to introduce yourself to the viewers?
Yes, hi, I'm Boots. I am I'm a sex educator, content creator, performance artist, visual artist. I somehow manage to do a lot of things and also like struggle to do anything. That's probably my tagline.
Hard relate to that.
Yeah, feel that.
Yeah. Whenever people are like, wow, you've done so much in your life, and I'm like, can I tell you how often it is difficult for me to get out of bed or like go upstairs? Yeah, very relatable. Other people in the chat are also saying it's relatable. Yeah. So then, what about other intersections of sort of consent and disability? I think that there are, like, for example, a lot of laws that talk about sort of capacity and also like people in certain types of roles. Like I know in Washington state, caregivers are not allowed to initiate any kind of sexual relationship, regardless of anything. And there's also just the idea of like in a previous stream, we talked about this Supreme Court case called Buck versus Bell. It was eventually overturned, but it was the like official Supreme Court case that made it basically law that anybody who was in any kind of like permanent medical institution for them to become sterilized and to be like prohibited from sexual anything. And I feel like there's a lot to talk about here, but I would love all of y'all's perspectives on sort of the legal aspects of the intersections of disability and sexuality and consent.
And I think a lot of it does dovetail back to what I said about people with disabilities not really getting to experience their bodies as their own. In today's day and age, this is such a fundamental thing that we're teaching to very, very young children. And yet when it comes to people with disabilities, even when they are adults, they don't necessarily have that right to, assert their own control over their bodies and express their preferences. So I think it's definitely very complex. There's a lot to talk about and there's a lot of work to do, but I think it really goes back to that basic idea that we mentioned before, right? And how to give people back ownership in a way that, keeps everybody safe and happy and healthy.
Yeah, I think a lot of this sometimes stems from purity culture and the sort of idea that sexuality is inherently bad unless it's about reproduction. And then there's this sort of eugenics level about like, oh, well, we don't want these people reproducing, so why on earth would we want them to be having sex? And it's like, well, okay, first of all, let's disentangle sex and reproduction. Like that's just, and also, disabled people have every right to have the same reproductive rights as everybody else. That is a separate issue altogether sometimes from sex and pleasure to me. But that sort of idea that it is inherently dangerous, and while it is true that disabled individuals are much more likely to be subjected to sexual assault, that says much more about the power dynamics in our society and the ability for people to report and the ability for people to talk about that than the idea that we must protect people, because a lot of times the way we protect people is to restrict access rather than to create open dialogues and to create ways for people to safely disclose or to safely talk about their needs, and to like talking about consent is so that other people can understand that people have desires and needs and it's acceptable for them to pursue those. And then if something happens, then you go, well, no, that's on somebody, violating their consent. This has nothing to do with the whether sexuality is good or bad. That's about pleasure. This is about somebody, abusing power. And, it is important to evaluate power when there are caregivers involved. But at the same time, somebody who has caregivers, like they're going to have caregivers. And there's often parts where people have romantic partners that are caregivers. So allowing, consent to become a bit more granular and to have that kind of open discussion is a really important thing. And as Ashir was focusing on, talking about, centering those with disabilities and the disabled and their decision-making process, as opposed to projecting outside control over them, because that's also not consensual.
Absolutely. Like, building off of that, I think too that the way laws is written, there's a lot of discomfort around nuance, and to a certain level understandable because nuance can be abused. But particularly here in the U.S., in a culture that is so carceral and penal focused, laws are written to punish and restrict rather than to empower. And if we could find a way to start flipping that script, I think that would open up a lot of those conversations like Sarah was talking about.
And I think a lot of this goes with what Ashira was saying, but it comes back to education. If we're not teaching people about autonomy, if we're not teaching people that you can say no, if we're not teaching people how to say no, as well as how to say yes to the things that we want to say yes to, then it's very difficult to have a culture, have a society of people, disabled or not, who are feeling self-empowered enough to set boundaries, who know that boundaries are a thing that you can even have, and how to get those boundaries to work for you, basically. So I think when we're talking about the law and consent and disability and sexuality, we basically have to go back to the most basic of building blocks, because people are not getting the education that they need around these topics. And a lot of that comes down to, we don't know what we don't know. So if we're not taught using a certain vocabulary, some people can't even name their body parts. It's this over here or that down there or something like that. And without the ability to name an activity, name a body part, name a feeling even, then we run into a danger zone where the law, going back to what Boots was saying, becomes very punitive. And it does that because we don't know otherwise, because we're not taught otherwise.
Yeah, I love how many overlaps there are with what our organization teaches as to what y'all are all saying. We talk a lot about capacity, and it seems like people really underestimate the capacity of disabled people to have pleasure. to know what they want for their own body and to access education and understand education and need education about their own bodies. And then that information piece of like the language, having the experience, like getting acquainted with your own body, and then how that impacts your ability to say yes, say no to things, and then have a voice in your greater culture and in the laws. So awesome. And I love the focus on pleasure too, because like I came to consent work really as like, I want to prevent trauma, and having that shift towards pleasure really changed everything in how I educate and how I teach. And so I think it's amazing that y'all are starting from that point too. I wanted to ask a little about your personal history into how you got into this work. Like, how did you get all of this education and knowledge that you are spreading? If you're interested in answering that one.
Can we go in reverse alphabetical order here?
Go ahead. Yeah. So, Sarah, would you want to start?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about grad school, but I guess I could say that I was in grad school getting my degree in exhibition design, and I decided to do, and I was already I've been dealing with disability my whole adult life, or not just even as an adult, and I was kind of pushing through education, and as someone who partakes in this sort of community BDSM scene here, I thought it would be really fun to kind of do, I wanted to do an exhibition on BDSM, and in 2015, there was a lot of talk about that subject, and consent was really starting to get talked about. This was before Me Too happened, and so I started working on my thesis, which was like designing a theoretical redesign of the Museum of Sex in New York. And then during that point in time, I experienced domestic abuse and assault. And the way my school system handled that on top of my disabilities was just like, I mean, I was in a tailspin for like 3 years of my life. And it was at that point that I was like, oh, okay, the exhibition design as a career, like that's great, but there's clearly this need. And having to survive that circumstance, and already was talking about it in this academic way, and I was using myself as a source in terms of talking about certain access needs and spaces, and talking about consent, because it was sort of trying to build this exhibition that went from consent all the way into certain like sexual subcultures and stigma. But it turned out that the things that were the most stigmatizing, like BDSM and all these other things, was like, oh no, there's basic stigma around just people with disabilities and how they talk about things and how they disclose and how we address these things, and to really sort of experience what I was writing about in my thesis firsthand, and then to come out of that, and there was really no going back from there. There was really just this matter of like, this is something that needs to be done. I've had to pull myself through this, and a degree of like, I never want anyone to experience this ever again, and of course I can't prevent that, but to sort of recognize what was important in that process. And so as I got my, as I was continuing to work on my thesis, I think I connected with Kaz long before I had joined Pleasurable, and then once I started to kind of get my consulting under control, I reached out, and here I am, and this is something that I'm just really passionate about, and is a lot of my personal experiences do inform my advocacy, and a lot of my personal observations of systemic issues, even in education, inform why I think this work is so important and so critical. And if that was happening in grad school, like I think about sex education in terms of elementary school, or so that sort of general idea for people to understand what people go through, and for people to be able to talk about sexuality. Because if you're not able to talk about sexuality, how are you going to be able to talk about the trauma
personal investment and lives at stake, for sure. Thank you. Reverse alphabetical, Kaz.
Thank you. Let's see. When I was a teenager, I had agoraphobia. It was really hard for me to leave my home, and I'm 40, so there was no Amazon.com back then. There was no I can order my books online. We didn't have that yet. So every now and then I would be able to work up the nerve to go to my local bookstore, and I would just spend hours upon hours in the way they had it set up was the sexuality section was right next to the LGBTQ section. And so I would just sit there for hours, going through everything that I could. And when I had some cash, buying things, and when I didn't have some cash, maybe taking some things. But it was no one's going to sell a 14-year-old Patrick Califia. You have to find a way to read that or get it home, something, in today's day, you can just order it online. Maybe you could get it in a bookstore. But back then it was no, this is an explicit book. You are still a child. There's a line here and we're not going to cross it. But that's the type of thing I was reading when I was 13, 14. And it was great for me because it made me realize that I was not alone in terms of my sexual identity, in terms of my sexual proclivities. And then Patrick also identifies as someone with a disability. So some of their later work is framed from that lens. And I think it just went from there. I can remember being in my early 20s and being at parties, and the people around whomever I'm talking to gets more and more sparse as people move away because they're what are you're talking about? Why are you talking about dildos? And people would get very alienated about the things that I was passionate about. And it just kind of went from there. I started taking classes online, usually put on by sex educators. And then because of my very vocal nature about what I'm interested in, friends of mine, usually cis male friends, would come to me and say, I'm being called out for a consent violation and I don't know what to do. And there would be a lot of well, I'm not your therapist and I'm your friend, but I haven't had sex with you, so we're going to draw some boundaries before I can help you with this. So I've been on, I guess, 4 different accountability pods over the years, and that's where my background in consent comes from, is trying to self-educate to a point where I would feel more comfortable listening to people who have caused harm, as well as hearing the people who have been harmed, and figuring out how to, as someone who's been assaulted multiple times, how do I strike the balance between empathy and not, the default, as Booth said earlier, is to punish someone who has caused harm. But we've all caused harm in some shape or form throughout our lives, and whether it's sexual or not. And so I've struggled to find that balance within myself rather, of helping people who've caused harm figure out why they caused harm, how it came about, what it is that they're doing wrong, why it's wrong, and how to hopefully make improvements so that it doesn't happen again, or it happens, as someone I was on a pod with said, so that you fuck up better next time. So it's not as bad as it was before, because life is a continual process of learning. So I guess that's my background on consent. And then my background on disability is, I was born this way, and I didn't get medical attention until much later. And because of that, in my experience, there are many issues of consent. I was a child begging my parents for medical help, which they denied, and I didn't understand why. And it wasn't until my 30s that I was finally like, okay, they were doing the best that they could. They didn't know any better. They didn't mean to neglect me, but they did. Learning about consent, how it relates to my disabilities, came very early, and I think it's all just merged into where I'm at now, and what I like to focus on now.
Rash has your personal story about being a young person in a bookstore and being in the LGBT sexuality section, sometimes vibing, sometimes, oh my god, hard relate. Being a queer, sex geek in a small town. I was also that kid. I have a distinct memory of being in 8th grade science class and having a copy of Kama Sutra hidden inside my science book. I was always the friend that everyone came to ask questions ranging from how do you know if you've had a climax to I think I might be pregnant even though we technically didn't do it. So yeah, born sex geek. As a young adult, I got into the entertainment industry, which was an awesome experiential and also educational space for me. And then from there, I eventually shifted into birth work, and it was actually a lot of my consent background definitely comes from adult industry practices and being in the BDSM community, but even more the deeper work came from birth work and trying to defend my bodily autonomy as a pregnant and birthing human, and then later being a doula and helping other pregnant and birthing humans write their birth plans and everything else. I've spent many years as a sex educator and other things now. The disability part, I have been trying to self-educate and be an ally for the last many years, and then just in the last year and a half, 2 years, I've actually first recognized that my own mental health stuff counts. Because imposter syndrome is the thing that I struggle with, and recognizing I'm not just an ally, I'm actually part of this community, and then becoming physically disabled as well in the last year and a half. So there's still a lot I'm feel like I'm kind of a newbie on my own learning journey as far as like that path goes. So yeah, I think that kind of sums me up.
Thank you so much. Ashina, did you want to answer this one? No pressure.
No, I think I'm gonna pass on personal experience question.
Sounds good. Such a wide variety of experiences, and it's really cool to get to know it all a little bit better.
Yeah, it's also really nice to hear some of my own experiences reflected, because there's always that issue of like beating oneself up for the ways in which, like, why didn't I understand this thing sooner? Or like, why am I only now good at self-advocating? Or why like I just remember I got into doing things like sex education when I was like 9 or 10 because I had friends who didn't realize that they were having sex. And I was like, oh man, yeah, do you not realize what it is you guys have been doing? And then also I got really into disability education because one, there was just like, I have many disabilities, but the first one I was ever diagnosed with was attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And like most people just think it's like can't sit still disorder. And it's like, actually, no, like, you know, it is a full body thing. Like I have muscles that don't recruit properly or don't recruit in the correct order or just don't respond. And that's related to ADHD. Having difficulty with fine motor control and having a huge delay well into adulthood. And I thought back on how when I was a kid, how many teachers would like make fun of my handwriting because it was really bad. And until college, I had to write on this paper that's like got the big lines with like the dotted line in the middle. But the teachers would like shame me about that as I just like wasn't trying hard enough, not knowing that there was like motor delays are involved. And like people really just have this idea ADHD is like can't sit still, like to climb on things. And it's like, yes, those things are true. I was like incapable of sitting down. And one of the only reasons why I got diagnosed so young was because I did present kind of stereotypically the way boys present, at least the stereotype of what that looks like. But yeah, just thinking about how often like I had to educate people about things as I was learning about it myself and like understanding it myself. And yeah, it's really difficult, and it's really yeah, I think it's really important to do this work as well. So thank you all for sharing all of that.
Yeah, the education paths are interesting. Like, I just had terrible sex education in K through 12, and that's what set me off on this path. Interesting to hear that of how you all found education for yourself. Shout out the bookstores with the sexuality and the LGBTQ sections. Those seem to be very impactful.
Yeah.
Or were you about to say something, Ari?
I was second guessing whether I should say it, but I was going to say shout out to kids shoplifting as an accessibility issue.
Yeah.
Access. So I was like, yeah, there were lots of things that I needed would have never been allowed to buy, and then I got them. You know, and I think it's yeah. Anyway, I was second guessing whether or not I should make that joke.
I tacitly approve. Yeah, are there any other people you want to shout out or orgs you want to shout out in terms of like your education or how you got here? There's so many people that I want to like connect y'all with after this discussion, but I want to know like who's on your radar in your community that you're really proud of or influenced by.
Wow. We could be on a call for hours just talking about this stuff. My favorite educators around disability and sexuality are Bianca Laureano, and yeah, like amazing work and amazing person. And I recently came across someone who is based in the UK, and her name is Penny Pepper. And she doesn't currently explicitly do sexuality work, but she used to. And she is disabled, and she is a vibrant firecracker of a person. I think she's amazing. The work that she's done in the UK has really helped, particularly people with juvenile arthritis, to really, has been very impactful. And then I would definitely say that the HEAL Project is a favorite of mine. They are working around childhood sexual abuse and as adults, and how that can impact pleasure. And We Know Ship out of, or I guess it's just Ship, and then their website is We Know Ship, so I get that a little confused. Out of Providence, Rhode Island, are doing great sex education both online and in person. So that's where I would start.
Thank you. Putting them all in the old group.
Still pretty new on this path, like I said, so I'm gonna say my favorite sex and disability educator is Taz.
Love that.
I'm gonna agree there.
Oh.
I'm turning like 5 shades of red. Thanks, folks.
I think for me, a lot of it has been people in my community that helped me get through things. There are a lot of books that I read and things, where I went through sort of childhood interest when I was younger. But I think right now it's a lot of the people who are in my community and the people who are teaching about various things, and sometimes to have people reach out to me for advice about disability, and people who are really striving to make spaces inclusive and supportive and sort of safe, but with nuance, because you can't make something wholly safe, but you can do your best to get as close as you can. And I'm just really looking up to organizers who they put a lot of time into it. They put a lot of time, and they're not getting a lot out of it. They're not getting a lot of support, but it's something that is important to them, and it's important to them to support their community and the people around them, and to support education and access, and who are really asking those questions and going out of their way to do that research that might not be teaching about sexuality and disability, but that are teaching about sex and are creating environments for people to talk about pleasure and to experience pleasure, and who are pulling in from every direction ways to get different perspectives and to be inclusive. And I've been on several of those, consent teams, and the amount that kind of comes together to help people get through difficult times, to provide that type of support. And everybody comes in with different educational resources, and there's sharing of those educational resources, and there's kind of growing together while you're also helping somebody facilitate growing in that situation. And so I really have to, I'm based out of the Washington, D.C. area, so just sort of my community, there's a community in Baltimore, there are people that that this isn't their career, but it is something that they spend, that is their passion, and that is who they are in terms of things like that. And I think individuals, communities are, having a local community is so critical and important for anybody.
Steps to that.
disability and sexuality in more of a narrow focus. I'm really, really grateful for so many of the people and couples who, YouTube and talk about their relationships online. So we mentioned squirming and groups before, just to really broaden out the conversation, show people that sexuality is not just about sex, it's also about a relationship, and, it's not just kind of that mechanical, clinical, technical, how do things work when you're disabled, which is so important to know and to talk about because things can be different with disability and there are things that need to be figured out. But even just to see that it is so much broader and people can have relationships, and I think that those YouTubers can also be a good entry point for a lot of people into the conversation, because thinking about sexuality very specifically can be very scary, daunting, and overwhelming for people. But when they see a couple just kind of being a regular couple talking about lots of different things in their lives, and then sexuality is kind of sprinkled within that, I think that could make the conversation feel a lot safer and more approachable for people. So I really am grateful to so many of those couples who put that part of their lives online for the world.
I wanted to check in on time and capacity because we said we'd be here for about an hour. I do have so many more questions I want to ask y'all.
Yeah.
But how are y'all feeling? One more, wrap it up here. We can always do this again.
I know we'd love to come back for a start, and I think let's try one more and wrap it up there.
Sounds good. Well, then I would like to bring it back to consent, even though we've been talking about it the whole time. And maybe just ask, what are your favorite consent practices or things that you love to educate people about?
I think mine is that my body is my own. I know from when I was really, really little, and I don't know how I got into this, and I'm very impressed with younger me, but I very much had this mantra wherever I was that, my body, my rules, and if you tell me to do something, do this many reps of whatever, stay on the treadmill for this amount of time, I would be very, very careful to follow that rule. But if you tried to get me to go 2 seconds over, I was like, no, you told me this and I'm following the rule, but it's my body, my rules, and we need to stay within those bounds. So I don't know how I got that. I would love to know, if I could interview 5-year-old me, I would be like, well, where did you come up with that one? But I think just really educating people on it is my body, and we do need to follow my rules, and we can work together, but we need to honor the agreements that we've made in the spaces that we're in. I think that's something that a lot of people across spaces, not even within sexuality, within healthcare, within other relationships, I think that's something that is really important to me to bring home to others.
Shout out 5-year-old you. Wow.
I think my big thing is having sort of implicit, mutually understood language is really important for negotiating and talking about things. And as someone who can go nonverbal or who can sometimes communicate with sounds that aren't words, having an understanding and talking about consent in terms of what no's look like, what yeses look like, but also how people express themselves, or and how expressive or non-expressive somebody is, and just the variations in the ways that humans communicate with their bodies and communicate with the sounds that they make, and the way they interact with one another is really just this sort of, there's this beauty in the way that we communicate through movement, and that is related to dance and performance and other things like that. But consent is about being like, okay, so if you do this, it's not just safe words, with green, yellow, red, but sort of there's signals where it's recognizing when somebody's like, oh yes, more of that, or no, less of that, and these different types of cues and ways that people can understand each other and coming at that from different sort of perspectives. I am autistic, and for me, it's almost like there's always a sort of performance. I'm just trying to understand what makes everybody unique, and everybody has different ways of moving and expressing themselves, and kind of ingraining that as like a code, as like, okay, how do I understand what's going on, and talking about consent in a broader way, and really seeing the nuances in which every individual person communicates differently, and how I'm able to like make a connection with someone, even if it's just through conversation, but making a connection with someone by getting to know how they express themselves and how they communicate, and when they're excited. It's like I love it when people like info dump, like they get really excited and they want to share something, and it's kind of like that's the type of enthusiastic sort of consent that we talked about. Is like learning to see when somebody's excited and learning to see when somebody's in something, and getting all of that information from another person, and how consent and obtaining consent and negotiation can be a way of really getting to know the person you're with, and that is really fun and enjoyable. It's not just this, checkbox formative, formal process. It's learning how to connect and communicate with somebody else. And I really love that, and it's a perspective that I like to come from, because it deals less with the trauma, and it deals much more with the excitement about why do we do this? We do this for good reasons too. So
That's all the jazz hands.
I don't know if I can answer like favorite, but I know one thing that I'm focusing on right now, what's been like really in my personal space, and what I've been kind of writing on right now is like really owning your yes and owning your desires, and going deeper with that communication. So like for example, like if my partner asks if I want to have sex that evening, I've been doing this practice where instead of like, say if I'm having like a high paying day at that time, instead of just being like, no, sorry, no, saying yes, I do, because there's a part of me that does. Yes, I do. And we're not going to, because I'm having really bad pain today. And so like honoring my desire and that yes that's in me, as well as giving like further context around it. And that practice has actually been like really nourishing for me personally and for our relationship. So that's like, I don't know, I guess an experiment that I'm working on right now.
That's really cool. And that, like, you were talking about nuance earlier, and those phrases like no means no, yes means yes. It's like no doesn't always mean just no. Exactly like you're saying, it can mean no because of all of these reasons, but the desire is yes. So I love you bringing up that nuance. It's a very cool practice. Yes.
I'm going to pass on this one so that I can get my next effects mini dose in.
Sorry. Thank you all so much for being here and spending your time with us and sharing amazing insights and being vulnerable and talking about your amazing organization, which we are going to promote as much as we can, because I think the work y'all are doing is amazing.
Yeah, really, thank you all for being here.
having us.
Thank you.
This has been great.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us in the chat. We've had lots of great messages of people being able to relate and support and getting excited about things. And I would love to have you all back again sometime in the future. Okay. All right. Bye.